Hey there. So the podcast is currently on an extended hiatus so that I can write my next book and work on some other exciting projects. But while we're away, I hope you'll enjoy this fan favorite episode from the archives. If you want brand new content to help you make peace with food and heal from diet culture, come sign up for my free weekly newsletter at christyharrison.com/newsletter, where I answer a weekly listener question. And as always, if you join my Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course at christyharrison.com/course, you get access to our exclusive monthly Q&A podcast where I answer all your new questions. Just go to christyharrison.com/newsletter and christyharrison.com/course to sign up, or click the links in the episode description. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths toward peace with food in their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised. Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Hey there, welcome to episode 226 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Kimberly Dark, who is a sociology professor, writer, and performer, and a second-time podcast guest. She returns to discuss her latest book, which is called Fat, Pretty, and Soon to Be Old. And we also talk about why appearance is a form of privilege, how ageism intersects with other forms of oppression, how neoliberalism, capitalism, and diet culture have influenced our ideas about self-improvement, why it's okay not to be a quote-unquote perfect activist, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question. I'm back to answering questions, and this one's a really juicy good one. It's from a listener named Taylor G, who writes, "Hi, Christy. I've been listening to the podcast for years and truly enjoy each and every episode, as I find the information incredibly helpful for my own path of intuitive eating. My question is, how can I begin to incorporate alcohol into an intuitive eating mindset? Intuitive eating encourages not labeling foods as good or bad, that all foods/calories are created equal. As I continue to try to incorporate this mindset into my daily life, I always get tripped up when it comes to alcohol consumption, whether it's beer, wine, or hard liquor. My concern is that the human body sees alcohol as a poison/toxin. I'm also aware of the high calorie content most alcoholic beverages contain. While I will drink a few times a week socially with friends, I find myself always choosing the lower calorie alcoholic option or not drinking at all and feeling guilty if I drink quote unquote too much. I enjoy drinking with my friends, but never feel well physically and mentally the next day. Do you think alcohol should make the consideration of being a quote unquote bad food since it is poisonous/toxic to the human body? And is it possible to drink alcohol without a feeling of negativity or guilt behind it and incorporate it into an intuitive eating mindset?" So thanks, Taylor, for that great question. And before I answer, just my standard disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, the short answer to this question is yes, it's definitely possible to drink alcohol without a feeling of negativity or guilt behind it and to incorporate it into an intuitive eating mindset. There are, of course, some people who have substance use disorders and stop drinking as an act of self-care. And I'd actually say that's intuitive drinking too, because those folks know their own bodies and minds. They know how alcohol affects their lives and their overall well-being. And they make a choice to stop drinking, not because there's some external rule against it, but because the consequences of drinking are harmful to them. But Taylor, who asked the question, it sounds like you're not in a place where you're making choices about drinking from an intuitive perspective. And from your question, I can tell you have lots of negative beliefs about alcohol. So I want to help unpack those to help you get to that place where you can be more intuitive about it. So first of all, calling alcohol a poison or toxin is really problematic because that's demonizing alcohol, that's labeling it as bad, and alcohol is not actually toxic to most people in small amounts. And I say most people because, again, of course, there are some folks for whom alcohol really is detrimental, namely people with substance use disorders, as I just mentioned. But for those who do not have a substance use disorder, who do not have a problem with alcohol, which is the majority of people, alcohol isn't a poison or toxin unless it's ingested in really large quantities. And alcohol certainly isn't the only thing that has the potential to be harmful in large quantities. A lot of the things we eat and drink are dose dependent. For example, even water, which is held up as this magical thing by the wellness diet and diet culture in general, even water can be toxic if you drink too much. There's a condition called hyponatremia, which is low blood sodium that happens when people drink too much water, and it's extremely dangerous for your heart and for your life, really. It can be fatal. Now, rest assured that you really are not at risk of hyponatremia if you're honoring your body's natural thirst cues and you're not overdoing it with the water. But I've definitely seen hyponatremia happen in people who have orthorexic beliefs about water being quote unquote purifying and that more is always better. And they can really overdo it on the water. And I've had a couple clients end up in the hospital with hyponatremia because they had these orthorexic beliefs about water. So that's not to scare anyone away from drinking water because water is obviously super important for our lives, right? For our well-being. And it's great to drink that and other liquids whenever you feel thirsty. But I say that just to point out that alcohol is not alone in being dangerous in large quantities, and that even water, this supposedly magical thing, can actually be harmful to us too. So it's a dose-dependent thing. And in smaller quantities, alcohol can be perfectly fine for most people. I'm not going to get into the numbers of like X number of drinks per week is okay and Y number of drinks per week is binge drinking, but you can look that up. There's National Institutes of Health and other, official definitions of that. And it's beyond the scope of this answer to talk about how to tell if you have a problem with alcohol. But I would say talk to your therapist, talk to your doctor, look online at some of the official recommendations of drinking and see if you fall over that. But Taylor, who asked the question, I think is not in that boat. So I'm going to focus this answer on intuitive drinking when you are able to drink, when you don't have a substance use disorder. And in fact, when that's the case, some research shows that having a few drinks a week may actually be associated with better health outcomes overall. Although that's likely because the kinds of people who regularly drink, say, a glass of wine with dinner or whatever, are more economically privileged and socially privileged. And we know that having those kinds of privileges tends to predict better health overall. So in other words, it's likely the economic advantages and not the alcohol itself that explains the observed health benefits associated with drinking moderately or whatever. But in any event, light drinking doesn't seem to harm health in those studies. So alcohol is not a quote unquote toxin or poison across the board, right? It might be toxic and harmful in large amounts, but actually research shows that in moderate amounts, it's not going to do any harm to your health. So for most people, again, not the ones who have known or suspected substance use disorders, but for everyone else, alcohol is not something that needs to be restricted or made off limits. Doesn't need to be on the quote unquote bad foods list. And the bad foods list in and of itself is problematic. So alcohol just needs to be approached with the same permission and intuition around how you feel when you drink it that you would give to any other food, right? Permission and intuition is the name of the game. And so that means that for some of us, intuitive drinking might look like having that glass of wine with dinner or a couple drinks with friends a few times a week because that feels good and brings pleasure. And for other people, intuitive drinking might mean choosing not to drink because you know you have a problem with alcohol, and not drinking is going to feel much better over the long run in terms of the effects on your life and your overall well-being. And of course, intuitive drinking can also mean choosing to drink or not drink on a particular occasion based on your own priorities and needs. So for example, I drink occasionally for pleasure and social reasons, and I've overcome any diet culture prohibitions on drinking. So I don't have those going on, but I might still choose not to drink at a particular event if I'm going to be speaking at that event, for example, and I want my mind to feel alert. or if I'm getting up really early the next morning. There's still reasons I might choose not to drink on a particular occasion, even though in general, I allow myself to drink. I don't have any restrictions on drinking. But for you, Taylor G., who asked the question, it sounds from your question like you're restricting your alcohol consumption primarily because of your fears about the calories in alcohol. And that is definitely a diet culture motivation. And when your worries about alcohol are coming just from diet culture beliefs about calories, as opposed to any substance use disorder, right, then it's essential to challenge those diet culture beliefs, just like you would with a food that you are fearful of because of the calories. So I think in your case, it's important to make peace with alcohol and talk back to that internalized diet culture voice that's telling you to always go for the lower calorie drinks or not to drink at all because of calories. So I would recommend really working on defying that voice by choosing something radically different than what it says. So if it's telling you to get a low-calorie drink, get a more energy-rich one that looks yummy to you instead. And by the way, I like framing it as energy-rich instead of quote-unquote high-calorie, because talking in terms of calories is a diet culture thing. And just the fact that you're talking about calories in your question tells me that you're still caught up in the diet mentality. And if that diet culture voice is telling you not to get anything at all to drink because of the calories, you can defy it again by also getting a drink that's energy rich and gives you pleasure rather than not drinking at all because of this worry about basically diet culture reasons. And Taylor, I know you said in your question, almost as an afterthought, kind of at the very end, that you never feel well physically and mentally the next day after drinking. Now, I obviously don't know you and your body and your life like you do, and I can't tell for sure just from a question, of course, but I do have a hunch based on how you worded your question and clients I've seen who framed things in similar ways, that the reason you're not feeling well the next day when you drink has more to do with self-judgments and diet culture beliefs about alcohol being a quote-unquote toxin, even that word also is very diet culture-y, than it does with how alcohol would actually be affecting your body in the absence of those judgments and beliefs. So in other words, I think your beliefs about alcohol are clouding how you feel and maybe creating some of how you feel. And that's because the mind-body connection is a really powerful thing. And people can have major symptoms come up based on simply believing that a particular food is bad for them. As I talk about in my book with the case of so-called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is not due to gluten at all, actually, but to people's beliefs about gluten. And of course, this is in the absence of actual celiac disease, I should say. So Taylor, my advice to you would be try challenging your beliefs about alcohol and making peace with it first. And then once you've really rooted out and thrown out those diet culture beliefs about alcohol, you can see how it's affecting you physically and mentally and really trust that those observations about how it's affecting you are coming from your intuition, not from your diet culture beliefs about drinking. And by the way, because I mentioned celiac disease, I just want to point out too that the distinction I've been making here throughout this answer between diet culture beliefs and true substance use disorders is kind of similar to how intuitive eating distinguishes between diet culture fears versus true food allergies. And that is, if you don't have a genuine medically confirmed allergy to a particular food and you're just worried about it because diet culture has told you it's quote unquote unhealthy or quote unquote high calorie, or you've gotten a bogus diagnosis of a food intolerance that is coming from diet culture rather than coming from actual medical science, then it's important to challenge your fears about that food in order to truly heal your relationship with food overall. And in contrast, if you do have a genuine food allergy or intolerance, like say a peanut allergy or celiac disease, then it's good self-care not to challenge yourself to eat that food. And it probably wouldn't have good consequences. It probably wouldn't feel good to do that. And so that in all likelihood means you wouldn't actually want to eat that food. It just wouldn't feel good to eat something you're genuinely allergic to. And so you can trust that aversion. And really most people, I think everyone I've seen basically with a genuine food allergy or intolerance has an aversion to the food because of how bad they feel after they eat it. So trust that aversion, trust that lack of desire to guide you in a case where it is a genuine food allergy or intolerance, because that's your intuition guiding you. And yes, you still technically could eat anything you wanted because we all have unconditional permission to eat. We all have bodily autonomy and can literally do whatever the hell we want as adults, right? No one is policing us. No one is stopping us. Even we could even do something that's illegal if we wanted to. but you just wouldn't want to do certain things because the consequences of doing them would feel bad in your body in the case of eating certain foods and would harm your life in the case of doing something illegal. And maybe also too, eating peanuts in the case of a peanut allergy, right? That would be harmful to your life. So you probably are going to have some natural aversions to things if you genuinely have an allergy or intolerance, a true allergy or intolerance that is not coming from false diet culture diagnoses. And I've talked about some of those false diagnoses on the podcast before. I go into depth about it in my book. So check that out for more on what's the difference between real and fake food allergy diagnoses. But in short, there are certain things where you can trust your aversion, your lack of desire for particular things. But if you don't have a genuine food allergy, then the bad feelings you might be having in response to a certain food may and likely do have more to do with what diet culture has told you about the food or beverage in question than with the actual food or beverage itself. That mind-body connection is really strong. So that is just an important thing to kind of tease apart. Is it a genuine substance use disorder, or is it fears about alcohol coming from diet culture? Sometimes it can be both, right? But if you have a genuine substance use disorder, it's good self-care to avoid alcohol. And I'm sure you already know that. I'm sure your intuition is already telling you that. And in the same way, is it a genuine food allergy, or is it diet culture beliefs about food or a false diagnosis of a food allergy that's making you fearful? Probably, again, in the situation of genuine food allergy or intolerance, your body's going to know. And if you have beliefs about the food that are maybe coming from diet culture, it's important to challenge them, but also take care of yourself at the same time. And one final note here for anyone who's just tuning into this podcast and maybe thinking about quote unquote food addiction, making a comparison in your mind to supposed food addiction versus alcohol addiction, like I was talking about earlier. That is not really a thing. Quote unquote food addiction is not a thing, even though it's very possible to feel like you're quote unquote addicted to food. Food is not actually an addictive substance. And so if you want to hear a lot more about that, you can check out episode 80 of the podcast with Marcy Evans and also episode 139 with Lisa Dubriel, which you can find at christyharrison.com/080 and christyharrison.com/139 or wherever you're listening to this episode. So, Taylor, I hope that helps you start thinking through your relationship with alcohol and exploring those diet culture beliefs that are coming up for you. And I'm sending you lots of compassion as you work on making peace with alcohol. If you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it much more quickly than I do here, you can join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. There I answer all the participants' questions every month, and you get access to our full Q&A library, which has hundreds of answers I've given to other participants over the nearly 4 years that I've been teaching this course. So you can really get into all the nitty-gritty nuances of intuitive eating with that Q&A series. When you join, you also get access to our private community forum that's exclusively for course participants so that you can get daily support and connect with hundreds of other great people who are in the course and on this intuitive eating path and supporting you. And last but certainly not least, I also give you tons of in-depth content guiding you through the principles of intuitive eating. And there's lots of stuff that I haven't shared anywhere else except in my one-on-one sessions with clients. So if you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Kimberly Dark. So Kimberly, welcome back to the show. I'm so excited to talk with you again. It's been about 1.5 years since we last spoke, so love to hear about everything you've been up to since you were last here.
That's a lot of things. I'm excited to talk to you as well. The biggest thing that's happening right now is the release of Fat, Pretty, and Soon to Be Old, which is about, intersectional appearance privilege. And I suppose we're going to talk some more about that. But also, since we spoke last, my other book, which is sort of a hybrid narrative novel called The Daddies, also came out. And I don't recommend releasing 2 books a year apart from each other. It's a bit much, but they were different publishers. And so that's just how it happened. I'm still doing the Yoga is for Everybody retreats here in Hawaii, which is where I live. And I've also added some retreats for professionals as well that are called Body Wise. And they're dealing with, well, the fact that we all carry unconscious bias, right? And even if we are intentionally wanting to welcome others into our classes or our practices or whatever it is that we do, unconscious bias can sneak in there and make people not feel entirely welcome. And so there are some specific ways to, I think, work with that and work with the biases that exist in our professions as well, because we reenact those sometimes without, this is how professors are and this is how therapists are. And, sometimes people don't feel welcome because of those professional biases too. So yeah, those are exciting retreats. 5 days here in the beautiful rainforest. We use yoga and nature and some group learning to get at some of that stuff. Hopefully for the long haul. We'll spend the rest of our lives unlearning our cultural biases after all.
Yeah, it's an ongoing project for sure.
Yeah.
But that's so nice to give people the opportunity to do that in a beautiful place, in nature, and just to have some kind of concerted time to spend on that.
Yeah. I think these are the main things I've been up to since we spoke.
Well, I'm really excited to dig into your latest book, Fat, Pretty, and Soon to Be Old, because I feel like that is such a great culmination of a lot of the things we talk about here all the time, and also brings up some new stuff that I feel like I don't talk about enough and think about in a way that is, I feel like your book has really helped advance the way I'm thinking about some of these ideas of privilege.
That's super. I'm glad that you're enjoying the book.
I think the first thing about this book that really strikes me is the naming of identities, even in the title, Fat, Pretty, and Soon to Be Old. And I think that we talk a lot on this podcast about the identity of fat and people who've reclaimed that identity and are fat activists and just destigmatizing that term. But I think, like, for me, pretty is kind of an interesting identity to claim and to unpack, So I'm really curious to sort of dig into that a little bit. How was it for you coming to name pretty as a privilege, and why do you think that's so important?
The title is so interesting, how things are titled. I've been doing performance work, like storytelling performances, for the last 20 years. And I can't say that I've come close to mastering this business of titling something, but I have come to understand that it's an important thing. And especially with a word like fat, people will not come to see a performance if it sounds like somebody's going to talk about being fat, because it'll make them feel bad. I did a show called Things I Learned from Fat People on the Plane that at least gave me a little bit of distance, right? That they thought they would hear funny stories from someone else. So I was feeling like, okay, the title of this book needs to be somehow lighthearted, but I also really wanted to name the fact that we're talking about intersections of privilege. And the thing about being pretty, you're not supposed to admit to that, right? Like, people know when they have beauty privilege. Like, of course you do. Of course, everyone knows when they have it or when they don't have enough of it, because of course that's context specific. Let's say I'm in Southern California and I go to a yoga class just at just any old studio in an affluent white area. There's going to be a very specific standard of attractiveness for the women who are there. And and nobody is supposed to talk about that, right? But it's specific to social class, it's specific to race, and it's also specific to geography, right? Southern California has a very specific blonde culture. there's a culture of blondness that kind of defines pretty for that context. So I'm saying all of this in order to say, I think that this is one of the areas of appearance privilege that we don't normally discuss, because no one is supposed to own that word themselves.
Right.
Like, it sounds vain to do that. But I'm also super aware that we sort of know culturally that for women, fat is supposed to cancel out pretty. But the fact is, it doesn't cancel it entirely. Right? Like, you live a different life if people can see that you have a pretty face, right? And that's I I know I'm not alone in this. That's the term I used to hear a lot growing up. Oh, look at you, what a pretty face. And often it was said as with pity, right? That look at the rest of you, right? It's a shame the rest of you, because, I was a fat child before I was a fat adult. I know that's not true for everyone, but it was for me. So I became aware that, my facial features are arranged in such a way that they are considered pleasing, and my skin is light enough and my hair is silky enough. And of course, all of that is embedded in white supremacy. But that those things create a certain kind of privilege, or said another way, they allow people to focus on me and listen to me in ways that they wouldn't listen to a fat woman otherwise. And so I think that part of what I wanted with this book was to put forth information in the context of stories, right? Because it's essentially a collection of stories about my life, my family, my son, my grandson. It's essentially a collection of stories. But the idea is that the basics of how sociologists talk about appearance and what it means to have privilege or be oppressed are embedded in those stories in such a way that hopefully the reader can see their own complexities differently. And of course, my end game with all of these stories, with pretty much all of the work that I do, is that we come to understand ourselves more strongly as social creators. As like literally, there is no part of human culture that was not created by humans. And we can look historically and see how culture changes over time. But wow, I want more people to think of it right now and go like, right, what am I creating right now? Because the way that I talk and behave and interact with others is going to set the standards for right and wrong, for respect and compassion well into the future. So that's really what I'm hoping for in the big picture.
I think that's so important. And I think for anyone who's new to this podcast or these terms of privilege and oppression, because I think we're probably going to have a fair number of new listeners in the new year when my book comes out. So, just for anyone who's new to these terms, can you explain like a quick definition of what you mean by privilege and what you mean by, I think oppression is pretty self-evident, but just in case.
No, I think it's important to actually to talk about definitions for both of those things, because oppression does not always look like someone's boot on your neck, right? Like I think we have this grand idea that in order to be oppressed, you have to be suffering, nearly mortal consequences, and that's not actually true. So when we start to look at data like how women are paid less than men, or how fat people have lower earnings over a lifetime than slender people, these are examples of oppression. And that doesn't just happen like you show up for work one day and somebody says, oh, well, you're a woman, so you're going to get 80 cents on the dollar. That's just how it is. No, these are a complex set of interactions and expectations that people enact, oftentimes without even realizing they're doing it, that lead to very specific consequences that we can see in patterns like data, that shows, oh, right, overall, women make less than men. And so I think it is important to understand that oppression is carried in policies and institutions, but it's also carried within each of us. I'm including myself there because, if we are lucky and diligent, we'll spend the rest of our lives unlearning the racism, the sexism, the sizeism that we've been handed, part of our cultural package. So this is what I'm referring to with regard to oppression, right? That it's those small moments, even microaggressions, moments where someone looks at you a certain way and you know that they feel hostile. And sure, you could be imagining it, but the fact is, let's say you're a fat person and someone looks at you that way. That's not the first time you experienced that, right? You've experienced it often enough that you could make a study. The same is true with racism, that sometimes in public interactions, white people can't see that someone has been oppressed based on race. Like, it's literally invisible. And it's not as if there's something stupid about, about those people who can't see it. It's just that we don't have cultural experience sort of discussing and teasing out what do we see in micro interactions. Back to the thing about privilege, appearance privilege. When I'm talking about appearance privilege, what I'm talking about again are those small, sometimes imperceptible kinds of favorable interactions that people with certain appearance have. So I've described this sometimes in the past, like, let's say, for instance, because look, going back to myself as an example for being pretty, but also being fat, right? Sometimes those things are seen as canceling out. Let's say I go to the post office and the person who looks up to help me sees a pretty person. So that person is going to make eye contact with me, is going to listen carefully to what it is I want to accomplish, is going to answer my questions and smile. That person is going to be relaxed and interacting with me in that sort of a way. Now, if I happen to go to the next window instead of the first, and that person looks up and sees a fat middle-aged lady, that person might make a little eye contact, but chances are they're going to be looking around. They're going to be wondering, who else is in the line and when am I going to eat lunch? They're not going to be as interested in what it is that I have to accomplish. Sure, they might just go ahead and do their job and it might have no consequences whatsoever, but that person is not going to care as much about the interaction. And that's subtle, sure. But the main point there is that I'm the same person either way. It's just that I have been perceived differently based on appearance. And this is that thing about beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but the context is cultural, right? So the fact that I can sometimes be seen as a pretty person, and let me just report that especially as I age, wearing lipstick, eye makeup really helps to be perceived as a pretty person. And, there's a whole body of research on this that's, it's often called, if you just Google the makeup tax, there are some interesting articles out there about how women have learned to boost their credibility by wearing makeup. This is an example, right, of how appearance privilege works. And of course, as women age, or if they are fat or disabled in particular, there is far less privilege accorded to them without those extra efforts. Is this helpful?
This is so helpful. Oh my gosh. This is great. And these are such important definitions. And I think the one thing that jumps out at me from that example you gave is just in the second example where the person is seeing you as fat and middle-aged and sort of treating you accordingly, according to the oppression that's embedded in those identities in our society at this point in history. They're not treating you with as much humanity. Your humanity is not being seen.
That's exactly right. It's almost as if there is a tape that plays in a person's head. And, any person, I want to go back to really saying that all of us have the same cultural defaults, but we can choose not to use them, right? But for any of us, it's kind of like a tape playing in the head that says, oh, I'm entitled to dismiss this person. I don't have to put as much effort into this interaction. And that is, if it's at the post office and it has to do with, am I going to get my letter to Alaska, then maybe the stakes are low. But you might imagine that at the doctor's office, for instance, is that doctor going to actually order the tests that might find the disease that kills me or saves my life? The stakes are much higher. So I think that, those cultural scripts that play in our heads they're not benign, right? It's not a benign circumstance. I would like to live in a world where we are all in the habit of acknowledging each other's humanity as often as possible.
I would too. And I feel like privilege is the unearned privilege of getting your humanity acknowledged and getting your rights honored all the, the human rights that we all deserve. And I want to live in a world where it doesn't take those unearned privileges to get those things.
Yeah. And I almost wish we had a better word for privilege, because sometimes it makes it sound like I came home one day and someone had installed a golden toilet in my house. It's like, wow, that's privilege. Look at that. But it isn't. It is the ability to be treated with basic humanity and basic attention, interest and attention. And for someone who has never lacked that, of course it is invisible. Of course, it just seems like, oh, the postal worker was nice today. Isn't that great?
People are so nice. People are great.
And this is true. I already used the example of the Southern California example. I mean, my goodness, I grew up in Southern California, and so that's maybe that's part of why I feel entitled to call it out a little bit. But when people come from elsewhere and do not conform to those appearance standards, they go home and report. They go home to the Midwest and report that, oh yeah, people in Southern California were a little aloof and everyone's so, hair flipping and, and like, kind of aloof. But whereas if that's the milieu that you operate in and that you conform to, then of course you feel warmly welcomed there.
Yeah, it's wild to think about that, and I think that's such an important point when we talk about thin privilege a lot on this podcast. And I am going to make an effort to talk more about pretty privilege as well, even though it's like cringeworthy to me to admit that I have that, because for all the reasons that you said of like naming yourself as such is seen as vain and, you're not supposed to do that. But, we talk a lot about these forms of privilege that I definitely get letters from people who are newer to this kind of social justice discourse a lot of the time being like, why are you talking about privilege? Why are you saying it's a good thing that you're thin? You should be saying that everybody is equal and that it's not a privilege to be thin. And I think it's just a again, maybe this word just isn't really the exact right fit. And yet it's the word that we've been using in social justice spaces for, I think, decades now. So it's kind of entrenched.
Right.
But I think there's that misunderstanding of what privilege really means. So I really appreciate your examples there.
I think there's another element here with regard to how we talk about fat community and how we talk about body positivity in particular. And that is acknowledging the fact that there are certain ways to be fat that are more acceptable than other ways. And this, again, has to do with how much does your fatness conform to pre-existing beauty standards. So, for instance, that kind of imperative that a lot of fat women feel in order to be acceptable publicly, that they need to be hyper feminine or hourglass shaped. I often ask students, because let me just tell you, university students also want to argue about this idea of privilege. So I often ask students like, okay, let's just get to a baseline here. Like, if you're a woman, is it more, just call out an answer. Is it more acceptable to have a big belly or a big butt? Like, everybody will call out butt.
Yep.
Is it more acceptable to have fat ankles or fat thighs? And then everybody will call out, thigh, right? And so it's like we can get very quickly to, right. So what you just described was gender conformity. And what you just described was the desirable hourglass figure, only plus sized. And so this is one of the problems, I think, when we are more interested, well, I hope we are not more interested in body positivity than in body sovereignty or liberation, because really what a lot of the body positivity efforts are saying is that, look, being beautiful and conforming to beauty standards is important enough that we want to let fat people into the effort as well. We want to expand what beautiful is so that it includes tall women or freckled redheads, or usually not very fat, but chubby women as well. And this is a game with diminishing rewards. The bigger aim, I hope what I'm pointing toward in the stories in this book is that if we come to a place where we recognize our power as social creators and we recognize the inherent humanity of every individual, and that body sovereignty means that other people can exist in ways that you don't approve of. Like your approval of someone is not necessary for their humanity to be forefront. That's really, I think, what we're aiming for. And then, then the things like fashion and makeup and hair, which are really fun and can be artful expressions, they can exist on their own without being associated with how much credibility do you have?
Right. Well, also you mentioned in the book, I think it's really useful, this concept of, you call it artful manipulation of privilege, using tools like makeup or hair or clothing in order to get advantages that you deserve and to get treated with humanity, knowing that that is what you're doing rather than pursuing it at all costs without that sort of awareness that, oh, this is a key to access privilege that I'm consciously using to unlock what I desire and deserve. And I still deserve all of the things, all of the respect, all of the compassion and care, even if I don't choose to use this key in this moment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, look, we are complex people, right? And I don't think it's wrong to acknowledge this is how the world works. Like if I were going to go to a job interview, I would definitely dress in a gender conforming way and I would wear makeup because, I usually dress gender conforming, but I don't usually wear makeup. So, but because I know that I'm going to be heard differently. Now, is it great if somebody, if a woman who expresses gender or appearance differently, is it great for that person to show up exactly as they like to be seen? Of course it is. Of course. But my goodness, I think that it's too much to expect that every time we are presented with a social conundrum that we choose the high road. That's too much to expect. And I think we need to, sometimes forgive ourselves for not being the warrior for social justice in every single circumstance. Like sometimes it's all right to go like, no, I want to be seen and I want to make sure I'm heard in this setting. So I'm going to conform.
Yeah. And there's privilege in taking that high road, as you say. Like, I think it's different how, you or I might be seen if we decided to not wear makeup versus how a trans woman might be seen if they decided to not wear makeup, right? Like,
correct.
We would still be conforming to other gender norms in a way that might afford more access than she would if she decided not to wear makeup. So, and there's lots of examples like that. There's a great piece recently in The Cut about this fashion trend of quote unquote normcore, where it's basically like, dressing as sort of frumpily as possible in a particular way, mom jeans and big sweatshirts and no logos and all this stuff. And the argument in the piece was really interesting was that, the writer was a fat woman saying that I don't have access to normcore in the same way. Like me dressing like that is not quote unquote fashionable by the standards of this trend. This trend is really only accessible to or made for people who are already thin, societally considered beautiful, where if they throw on this normcore outfit, they're still going to be considered hot, they're still going to be considered fashionable. Those are like the Instagram influencers who get to wear that style, not a fat woman who would read as quote unquote not hot.
Right, because the immediate trigger there would be, oh, this person is lazy and sloppy, as opposed to, oh, this person is challenging norms. Isn't that cool? That's a perfect example of how the default scripts about who people are, that fat people are lazy and sloppy, for instance, that's a perfect example. Perfect example.
Well, I'm so curious too to talk a little bit about this idea of self-improvement that you discuss in the book and like why that's can be harmful or problematic. Because I think, there's this idea of the artful manipulation of privilege is one thing where we can kind of consciously use these tools to our advantage, but then the sort of rat race of constantly trying to quote unquote improve ourselves can be a very different story. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, the sort of like neoliberal idea of self-improvement.
Yes. And I think I talk about this in the introduction to the book. Look, I find this fascinating that when you read women's diaries, like as historical documents from 100 years ago, for instance, self-improvement is often thought of as I'm going to try to be nicer to people, or I'm going to try to learn another language, or I'm going to try to read more books. Now, look, some of those, like being nicer to people, are culturally embedded gender ideas of the time. Of course they are. But at the same time, when you ask those same questions, like what does self-improvement mean to you of young women today, the answers are always appearance-based. Like got to do something with these bangs, and I want to work on my fashion sense. And I don't know about,
wellness, quote unquote.
Yeah, want my thighs to be thinner, not because I'm shallow, but because I want to be healthy.
Right. Oh, it's always conflated with health.
So, so there is a shift here, and I think that the introduction to this book really is talking about how consumerism specifically and capitalism more broadly really influence the way appearance privilege and lack of privilege functions in our society. So there's this paradox right now where people are also constantly in pursuit of more education in order to become more marketable, but incurring tremendous amounts of debt to do that. And some other authors have explored this in greater depth. Laurie Essig is one of them, whom I mention in the book. And she notes the rise of consumer credit as a key in the increase in numbers of people pursuing plastic surgery, for instance. We used to think of plastic surgery as something rich people had access to because they could fix their nose or fix their boobs or fix in order to become more conforming and therefore bring more privilege. But now, if you look at what are the demographics of who does surgical interventions, and look, surgical interventions into appearance they're just a click away from having to have a certain skincare regime or a certain makeup, certain clothes. I mean, it's just a click away. And those interventions are now people of all social classes pursue those interventions. And those interventions are seen as an investment, literally an investment in my employability or my ability to make more money or to find a good husband. So we are seeing improvement as appearance conformity and racking up the educational credentials. I mean, I know it sounds a little strange that I'm putting these in adjacent categories, but I think that it's telling to look at how are we accruing debt as a culture right now. And those two things are really side by side. And dieting, of course, is part of the appearance project. I'm thinking right now in terms of the prettiness thing, but dieting is certainly a huge, as we know, right? Multi-billion-dollar industry that is definitely part of the appearance project.
Despite any assertions to the contrary, like it's not about aesthetics, it's about health.
Yeah, no.
That's what diet culture these days wants you to think. But yeah, no, it's
exactly because nobody's shallow.
No.
Nobody wants to be seen as But there's another issue here, which is it's not actually shallow to acknowledge where privilege exists, but if we can acknowledge with an eye toward dismantling, that's actually, I think, where we want to be headed. To remember that, it may seem really desperate that you get a certain look so that you can get a better job. That is not incorrect. But at the same time, where is the sense of, oh, that's really wrong that I have to look a certain way to get a certain job? How do we change that? And I think that's what perhaps we have lost track of, is the idea that the culture is being created by us literally every day.
Right.
And so how do we change that? Well, If you're in a position to interview people, you change how you look at them in those interviews. If you're in a position to interact with somebody at your gym, at the yoga class, at the supermarket, you change the way that you acknowledge other people's humanity.
That's so important. And I feel like the project of looking deeper is what's really important, no matter where someone falls on that spectrum of deciding to use tools to try to access greater privilege or not. Like one thing, I describe myself as an anti-diet dietitian. My book is called Anti-Diet. And a question that I sometimes get from people is, or that sort of an assumption that they make, I think, about me from that is, oh, you're anti-dieter. Oh, you don't like me because I diet, because I want to lose weight. And I always say, like, I'm not anti-dieter. I'm anti-diet culture, anti this oppressive system that tells people they need to shrink their bodies in order to be worthy, that tells people they need to lose weight in order to be quote unquote healthy, or manipulate their food, or, anything else in the sort of fat phobic and food phobic rubric that is diet culture. And, it's not about the individual choices, it's about the system. Like, that's what I want to dismantle. And I totally get that individuals within the system are going to want the things that they've been told to want and conditioned to want, such as weight loss, such as quote unquote perfect diet, because that's what we've been conditioned to think is the ticket to less oppression, and often even is, especially for people in very large bodies. It's like losing weight might give you access to much needed healthcare, like gender affirming surgery or a knee replacement. There are very real reasons why people feel pressured to lose weight and to do that to get access to more basically human rights and more humanity, more equitable treatment. And so I'm not against any individual making those choices, although I do hope to help individuals become aware of what conditions those choices and maybe help them to make a different choice and empower them, give them some tools and some community and resources to help them do that if that's something that feels attainable to them. And I know that a lot of people maybe aren't going to be able to make that choice, but I just want to help people become more aware, because I feel like that's the key. Like you said, if we can start becoming aware of these systems of oppression and privilege that play on us, then maybe we can start changing the world so that that doesn't continue for generations and generations.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. And I think that we are literally living in the paradox, right? Like it's not possible to be one way or another on this issue. We are living in the moments where those forms of oppression, you just mentioned, I'm going through this right now where I've got a knee issue and, my health plan does not cover knee surgery for high BMI individuals. And that is literally a circumstance that I'm confronted with, right? And so I think we need to let go of the idea that there is a right answer to how to be perfectly informed and behave perfectly about these very complex social justice issues. There's not a right way to handle that. There are a range of options for what am I going to do next. And I think it's useful to keep reminding myself there are always a range of options. It's not just, can I get this surgery? No, you cannot. It's not just that. There's a number of things that I can do. One of which is which I already have done, is to send information to my health plan about the success of these surgeries in higher BMI people. Now, do I expect that to have any kind of immediate result? No, I didn't do that for me. I did that for the possibility down the road that someone will say, oh, well, I think I saw a thing once. Maybe we should open this conversation.
You're planting a seed.
Right. I think that's a great distinction, that you can be anti-diet without being anti-dieter, because, there's a whole bunch of good reasons a person might go on a diet. And it's probably a poor choice for a range of other reasons, social included.
Right. Yeah. I think also diet culture fails to, and actually appearance, capitalism and sort of the beauty industry as well, fails to highlight the negative ramifications of the things they're selling, right? It's always like, go on this diet and you'll lose weight and your life will be perfect. Go on this diet or this quote unquote protocol or lifestyle change. It's not a diet, it's a lifestyle change. Just do this and then you'll be healthy and you're going to live forever. And nowhere in there is there, maybe it's in fine print because it has to be, per the FTC or whatever, or maybe it's not, but there needs to be sort of a larger discussion around what is actually likely to happen when you do this, that you're going to maybe lose weight in the short term or maybe not, but in the long term, you'll end up most likely regaining it back and then some, and not because of the weight, but separately. Your health is going to be put at risk by those weight cycles, independent of your BMI, wherever you started or ended up. And so, sort of giving people that information, I think, is one of the things that's missing. And I think similarly, too, with your work and talking about beauty standards and appearance standards in general, it's just sort of opening the curtain on like, what are the negative ramifications of this? Or what are the things that our system doesn't tell you about this, how this whole edifice was constructed, and sort of exposing the man behind the curtain.
That's exactly right. And, I think it's really important that we hold on to as well. Many of our appearance standards in the United States were culturally constructed as a response to slavery, of needing to justify slavery through ideologies of white supremacy. And Sabrina String's new book on
fearing the black body.
Fearing. I was about to say, hey, I couldn't remember if it was hating or fearing, but they're similar in this regard.
Yeah, basically.
That's a good resource for looking at, the racialized origins of fat hatred and the fear of fat. But so many of the cultural edicts that we have regarding appearance are rooted in white supremacy, and then also gender hierarchy as well.
Absolutely. And I think when you look at that and you see those cultural roots of those appearance standards, it makes it maybe a little easier to say, you know what, I'm going to resist this, or I'm going to question this, and maybe judiciously choose which of these standards I want to use as a tool for my own liberation.
That's right.
I want to talk a little bit too about the age piece, the soon to be old aspect of your memoir, because I think it's really interesting, again, that ageism really intersects with so many other forms of oppression, and definitely with body size-based oppression. But it's not something that we've really explored that much on the podcast per se. So I'm curious kind of what your experience has been as you're aging in a fat body, the sort of nuances of that.
Yeah, I really think that this is a critical intersection that I think you're right. We've not explored adequately, even as we discuss the experiences of fat people in our culture. We haven't looked at the intersection of aging so much. And I think that folks will find in this book, some of the stories are looking at, or they're about, right? Because again, all of these concepts are embedded in storytelling, which hopefully is sometimes funny, sometimes touching, sometimes shocking. But I used to be a far more athletic person than I am now. I've always been fat, but it really is interesting to see, especially as my physical abilities have declined because of arthritis, primarily, that I'm now more what people expect in fitness settings. And I spent a lot of my life being the magical unicorn in fitness settings, right? Like the person that was busting up the stereotypes. And I was shocked. I mean, shocked, I tell you, to find out that I was carrying some of these same biases about basically people with the body I now have, right? So there's a couple things here. One of them is, look, we don't know things until we know them. And sometimes it takes personal experience to know things. And this is why also proximity has always been the way that humans learn about experiences they don't have, right? It's why I was going to say it was so important to deal with racial segregation in America, but we haven't really dealt with it yet. And why it's so important that people know that straight people know gay people, right? Like as soon as all of a sudden, folks started talking about getting married to somebody of the same gender, it was like, oh, actually, I had those same feelings and those same thoughts when I was planning a wedding, and I guess you're not that different than me. So there's so many ways that being separate leads to narrow thinking, and further isolation. And so, I think that when we're in a place where either we have to deal with something ourselves that we hadn't previously dealt with, like going to an exercise class, for instance, and needing to take every modification offered rather than being able to just do what the teacher is saying. Suddenly, I had a new view on life that I hadn't had before. And I had a different type of compassion and understanding for other people who have always operated that way, for instance. So I think that, aging is also, it is the one form of stigmatized identity, I think, that just by living a long time, you're going to end up with it. You're going to end up with that stigmatized identity just by living. And there's others that perhaps people go a whole lifetime without ever experiencing them. But, if you live long enough, someone's going to turn and look at you and go, oh, you guys, you're old.
Right. If you're lucky, it will get to that point.
If you're lucky, you get to that point. But that soon to be old thing came about as a result of my son saying to me, my son is 30 now. And at some point, though, I don't know, probably almost 10 years ago, he says to me, so I don't know how much longer you're going to refer to yourself as middle-aged, because, you're already planning to live well past the national average. I go, wow, like that's the kind of thing your kid says to you. But it's also like, it just stuck in my head, like, actually, that's really true. That if you look at what is the national average age of death for women, I passed the middle. I'm past it. And so we have this like weird liminal space, I think, where you're not supposed to admit to being old, right? You're not supposed to, because that's a negative identity, but you're also past the middle, so is middle-aged still the right thing to say? I don't know. And then I started really looking at, okay, the word old, like the word fat, is actually a neutral descriptive term. Right? It's meant to describe a time of life, not, that is past the middle. At least we agree on that, right? It's somewhere past the middle. And yet, like the word fat, it is one of the few descriptive terms that almost exclusively has a negative connotation in our culture. And, that we don't look at, nobody says, oh, she's really old, to mean wise, or to mean gray-haired, or to mean, you know what I mean? Like it's usually meant that person is out of touch, or somehow irrelevant, or requires care, or is really tedious, or can't use their cell phone, or do you know what I mean? It's meant negatively. So I kind of liked the idea of reclaiming those words fat and old in the title of the book, and making a sandwich of the word pretty so that we can be clear that appearance privilege really is an undulating, it's not a solid, right? It's a viscous thing that seeps in around the edges, right? Like you can have appearance privilege one moment and lack it in the next. It's a fascinating thing, because I'm in favor of complexity. I'm in favor of how can we be as much of our complex selves as often as we can. Like, I think that is one of the paths to shifting the culture is, in the book, I also talk about being queer. I also talk about being a parent. These are also identities. The parent identity is a laudable one in our culture. Queer, not so much. So there are various ways to have appearance and identities that invoke or suppress respect. And I think that just by staying in our complexity as often as we can, we start to bump the boundaries out on who gets to be respectable.
So true. And I love that you wrote your book as a memoir. And I think generally, it seems like all your projects, your in-person, performances and books are based on storytelling from this sort of personal perspective. Because I think it does really help create that sense of you as a whole person and a complex person.
Well, I'm glad it's helpful. It's not that I think there's something so all fired interesting about my life. It's not that at all. It's just that my life is a tool for experimenting with the expectations that the culture has given me. And I think that that is true for every single person, right? So part of what I'm hoping for is by embedding these ideas in first person storytelling, in stories about my life, is hopefully I'm modeling that you too can use your life as a tool for experimenting with social expectations and a tool for creating culture day by day. Also, of course, my stories are the ones I'm entitled to entitled to manipulate. so, so it seems responsible to use mine instead of somebody else's. I don't know.
That makes sense. Totally. Yeah. And also too, being yourself and honoring who you are and all its complexities is a really empowering thing for other people. It really elucidates your humanity, as we were talking about. It rounds out a picture of who you are.
I hope so. I hope so. I also just do really hope that, there's nothing exceptional about the stories that I tell in that book. Many people have experienced the same kinds of privileges, oppressions, joys, triumphs, many people. And especially close to the end of the book, where I'm giving examples for like how, for instance, one of the stories in the book, I sit down to dinner with a group of friends from the neighborhood, and one of my friend's grandsons looks at me and says, she's fat, right? Which is one of those moments that, culturally, we've learned to sort of pull back and everybody goes quiet and it's uncomfortable, right? And then you sort of ignore the child, or somebody says, stop it, or don't say that. But, there's a moment in this story, though, where I just look at the kid and I go like, oh, wait, did you just call me fat? And then of course everybody like leans in, and I go, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with being called fat, because it's not bad to be fat, but look, that's sometimes an insult word. And so if you go around saying that, you might hurt somebody's feelings. But wow, I mean, better wait till they say it themselves, and then it's okay to say it. But there's nothing wrong with being fat. It's just one of the ways bodies can be. So what?
Yeah.
So, so I look at the child with that kind of eye contact and that kind of message. The point here being, when we're surprised by a child popping off with something like that, we rarely know the right thing to say. And that's why people kind of recoil and shut up. But why be surprised about things that are said again and again and again? And I really think that we have the capacity to do better, right? Like, there is nothing miraculous about the fact that I have thought about those kind of things that kids say. I thought about it and I came up with a better answer. And then the next time it happened, I said that thing. That's not rocket science, but it's not something that people do very often. And my real hope is that, by the time you get to the end of the book, there are some examples in place for how you might take humorous, compassionate control over situations where something else should happen, right? Something else should happen here. We don't always have to go silent, but it's okay in a moment if you're surprised. Of course, that's not a moment when you know what to do. Just plan ahead.
Well, also, I think, too, the one reason maybe for that silence and that sort of shutting down that we do around those moments is that there's like this shame for the person who's being labeled.
Yes.
And there is this shocked silence or recoiling from witnessing that shame or witnessing somebody being shamed in that way by something that, by a label that is stigmatized in our society.
Yes.
Because I think the person who is on the receiving end of that a lot of the time feels like it's their fault, feels like they're bad. Like if you were someone who did not have all the cultural knowledge that you have and hadn't reclaimed the word fat, to hear that might have been like a knife to the gut, like a real painful experience. And then what our culture teaches us in those moments is like, well, now I have to do something about it. It's my fault that I'm fat. I'm bad for being fat. Let me go on a diet to stop other people from ever calling me fat again, rather than, with the perspective that you have of like seeing it as a moment to create culture and help shape this child's view of things. And, the fact that you have all this experience behind you of having reclaimed the word fat already and doing this cultural analysis, I think it makes it a completely different experience.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about all of those reasons that people recoil in horror. They don't want to make it worse for the person who is being insulted. But I also think, there is a place for the person being insulted to talk back, which is what I did in that moment. There's also a place for upping our bystander game, like being better at what kind of responses we give. So I'll give you an example in this case. I tend to date women who are not gender conforming, right? That are masculine of center, so to speak. And, I've certainly been the bystander in the situation where somebody says, what are you, a man? What are you trying to, this sort of thing. And yeah, that's uncomfortable and potentially frightening when it happens, right? If somebody's trying to get puffed up like they got something to prove. But again, after experiencing that a few times, it's possible to come up with something to say. And if I'm in that kind of situation, I often will say to the speaker something like, oh, for goodness sakes, I suppose you just like everything to be, in its own little category, don't you? Because, certainly, is there an ideal man out there for you or an ideal woman? Marilyn Monroe, maybe, or maybe, you don't look like Marilyn Brando yourself. I mean, what are we trying for here? There's a way to invent a response where we have been taught the only response is shame. And I don't live up to my own standards about this every single time. I absolutely don't. But I think we can do better, right? We can be better bystanders. We can be better at, oh, somebody tried to hand me some shame. Here, I'm going to hand it back. or here, I'm just going to put this down and have a conversation with you, right? So I think that we can be better at it. And hopefully that adds to compassion, because I'm definitely not in the camp of, I would never tell a child, don't say that. Somebody's fat, for instance, right? Or I don't know whether you're a boy or a girl. That's not helpful to just say, be quiet. But to illuminate the architecture of that social experience, that is powerful.
Yeah, because that's teaching the kid some cultural analysis right there, too. That's kind of helping them pull back the curtain on why maybe they've already learned that fat is bad, or they're using it as an insult, or they're so curious about someone's gender presentation or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I also love that you say that it doesn't happen that way every single time, that you're not always living up to your own standards with it or whatever, because I think of my own life too. And I think about the times when I'm just like in a hurry to get somewhere or dealing with my own shit and don't have the mental and emotional energy to take on what could be a big conversation, or, just all kinds of other reasons that we might not show up in that way every single time or have those difficult conversations every single time. That's okay too. But to the extent that you can and you feel okay to show up in that way on a given day, it's a good thing to try to do.
It's a good thing to try to do. And it's also, I do just want to say, it gets easier with practice. That sometimes, like the first time that you pipe up with something different, there's some adrenaline in that. There's some like, oh my gosh, I am saying something that is outside the norm, and will I end up hated? But the fact is, most of the time, nobody hates you. Sometimes people actually appreciate the way it went, right? And then the next time it's not as charged. And so, I find that there are certain topics, certain ones are still harder for me than others. But with certain topics, fat being one of them, I often have a ready answer for your nonsense. Whatever your nonsense might be, right? Like it's like, hang on, I got this one.
There's kind of like a standard repertoire of nonsense too when it comes to that. I mean, really, probably when it comes to anything that people get challenged on.
I think that is important to know too, is that it gets easier. And the fact is, you're, to paraphrase Audre Lorde, your conformity will not protect you either. She says your silence will not protect you. That's absolutely true, but neither will your conformity. There are still going to be social circumstances where things don't go well, and it happens out of the clear blue because of someone else's anger or the distress of their day or life. And we can't just expect that by being silent and trying to be as conforming as possible, that somehow that's the safe path. We may as well try and invent a better answer, forge a clearer path. You may as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great note to end on. I love talking with you, and I could talk with you forever, but let us know where people can find your book and learn more about your work and all the good things.
The book, Fat, Pretty, and Soon to Be Old, should be available everywhere. Your local bookstore should be able to get it. And it's also, of course, available from any of the online behemoths that sell books. And KimberlyDark.com is where to find information about the retreats that I do in Hawaii and other writings. There's a page where there's probably 30 articles you can just click on and read for free that are there on the website too.
Awesome. We'll link to that in the show notes and put a link to your book as well so people can find it and get it. It's so good. I'm so excited about your book and all your books and all your work.
I'm excited about your book too. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much. So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Kimberly Dark for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some guidance to help you get started on the anti-diet path for yourself, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food, which you can get at christyharrison.com/strategies. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast and want to help support it, you can share this episode and also make sure that you're subscribed to the pod by going to christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, plus a full transcript, you can go to christyharrison.com/226. That's christyharrison.com/226. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address where it says get the transcript. This episode was brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. You can go to christyharrison.com/book to order it online, or pop into your local independent bookstore and ask for Anti-Diet. And by the way, if you've already read the book and loved it, as I know a number of you have, I would be so psyched and grateful if you left an Amazon review and marked the other 5-star reviews as helpful on Amazon too, because those reviews help more people discover the book, which helps grow the anti-diet movement and ultimately helps make the world a safer place for all people of all shapes and sizes, including the very largest sizes. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I am your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.